Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Every 2 weeks, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Today's guest is Ben Galley, author of Heart of Stone, the Chasing Graves Trilogy, the Scarlet Star Trilogy, the Emaneska series, and the Scalussen Chronicles, including its latest release, Heavy Lies the Crown. He's here with us to talk all things world building. But before we dive in, tell us a bit about what we're drinking here in the pub today.
Hey, Jim. Yeah, I am drinking an old-fashioned today. One of my favorite drinks. A classic, and it goes down far too quickly for my liking, but yeah. That's how I get into trouble.
Absolutely. All right, well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Right. So, the kind of tough question for any authors to describe themselves, even after writing book after book. But yeah, in simplest terms, I'm Ben Galley. I'm a UK author, hence the accent, living currently on the west coast of Canada. I have been writing for the last 10 years and self-publishing for the last 10 years. 11 now, actually. And a range of fantasy books. Thank you. Yeah, I've written a range of fantasy books and series, three series, one on the way to being complete, and a standalone. That was the Heart of Stone you mentioned. And yeah, I write epic fantasy with a lot of darkness in it, but a lot of dark wit at the same time, straying into grimdark, Weird West on one series. And so yeah, very kind of unorthodox fantasy, or I like to think so. Character-led and also world-building-led, which is why I'm excited to be chatting today.
Perfect. All right, so if you had to paste a definition onto the concept of world-building, what would it be?
A concept is always difficult, but I always describe it. I always describe my kind of process of world-building as basically canvas building. So it's something that, I think a lot of people think world, they think actual full-on globe of detail. And I think, it is the stage, it is the canvas for the art, it is the stage for the actors, and, it's the kind of the setting for your world. So yeah, that's kind of how I describe it in general. But yeah, obviously it's much vaster than that, as we're probably going to get into. But yeah, that's probably how I describe it in its smallest form.
So you talked a little bit about having stories that are very character driven, and you're also very well known for your world building. So my next question is, do you tend to build your worlds around your characters, or do you build your worlds first and then populate it with your characters?
It's interesting. I was thinking about how to answer this earlier because I do switch between the two, annoyingly. So there's no kind of definitive answer for this. Taking it back to my series, the first books I wrote were the Emaneska series. And so in that one, it was kind of the idea of the character. Even though the name of the world just popped into my head one day out of completely nowhere. It was kind of random. The actual idea of the main character, Farden, who's throughout the first series and is also featured in the new Scalussen Chronicles. The idea of his spell book tattooed into his back, and obviously his armor that's kind of features throughout the series as well. Those two things were what led the story and the actual story creation and kind of the genesis point for the entire series. And obviously it led on to the world. But yeah, that was character driven. And then with other worlds, or other series, it's been the opposite. I've kind of traded back and forth. Heart of Stone was actually character driven, so that was my third book. Let's go in order. So after Emaneska series with the Scarlet Star Trilogy, that was driven by the world. So I alternated back to world building, and that was the idea of a kind of an alternate 1800s Wild West sort of setting. And then Heart of Stone went back to the character, and that was the idea of a war machine made of stone, 500 years old, absolutely indestructible, a golem called Task. And then switched again. I've just been flip-flopping back and forth because Chasing Graves, my last series, was all about this world where ghosts are enslaved as basically servants for the rich and the powerful, and the whole world revolves around necromancy and death and essentially slavery. And so that's kind of the progress I've gone through. The book ideas that I've got kind of written down. I've got this big old chunky book of anything I think of gets thrown in the book. And I was kind of going through them just before this call, and I was just thinking, trying to give them a score essentially, which one's a character in the world. And it is predominantly 75% world. So I kind of think of a concept for a setting essentially, and then populate it with characters, kind of in the majority of the way I approach things. But yeah, the world to me is always kind of, it's also a character as well. So I mean, yeah, expand that concept of world building out. I always like to make the world, however simple, even if it's just harsh weather, and kind of feature as much as a character would in the actual fantasy novel. So it is a setting, but it affects the characters, it affects the plot, it has its own kind of whims, unpredictable whims as well. So yeah.
So you with going back and forth, I totally get that. For me, I have one book out, but I have others kind of in the ether, and each one has been its own beast. Like you have to kind of write it its own way. And so I'm curious with jumping back and forth, do you think that it's just whichever ideas come first you build around, or is it whichever kind of ideas are the strongest seed to grow from?
I think it's, I would say primarily the former, because to me it's the spark. You've got to have this passion for an idea. You've got to sit up in the middle of the night and be, oh dear Christ, I have to write this down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or it's something that, there's something just that steals you away from another book, something that just, like I said, the spark that just makes you want to dive in and get it done. And that's where a lot of the kind of the quickness, I think, of writing, or the speed of writing comes from, or at least the actual focus on the project as well, if you're not a speedy writer. And I think so, that's always whatever's kind of come first and just hooked me. And so that was, for instance, going back to the Chasing Grave series. It was this idea of this vast city just populated by the dead, and even though it was kind of changed and altered around, and obviously changed a lot before its kind of final product, it was just that idea of just like, well, what would that do? What does that mean? And how they control, what powers do they have? And it's kind of like the kind of the first step over that rabbit hole. And you suddenly just think, right, I'm just going to throw myself down here and see what happens. And then suddenly everything else comes to it. And then you think, well, I, of course, need a main character who's a ghost. And then, suddenly the world is populated. And I need this guy who's a ghost enslaver and all this sort of stuff. And then, it just kind of tumbles down. So whatever the idea is, whatever the spark is, in fact, for the most recent book, the one I followed was the concept of mile-high trees. A little bit out of top, but a little bit inspired by the scenery around here on Vancouver Island. There's a place nearby called, say nearby, it's about 2 hours drive, Cathedral Grove, which is a lot for the guy from the UK, but North Americans, Canadians, and you guys from the US, it's just like, well, no, that's just down to get the groceries. But either way, So there's this place called Cathedral Grove, which is full of these incredible trees. Not the absolute biggest in the world, not similar to the California redwoods, slightly smaller, but still, taller than the Tower of Pisa. There's this one here, and it's just insane. And suddenly, that was the moment where I thought, I need to write about these. And of course, giant trees, mile high. You never do anything normal in fantasy, definitely not. And so I just decided to write mile high trees, and it's spawned this entire series that I'm writing on. Series that I'm working on the first book of now, with David Estes, and it's just hooked me. Absolutely.
Get those ideas, and then the kind of the cause and effects chain starts spiraling from there.
Oh, exactly. Even just a name. I had. I probably won't use this because it's difficult to fit the word Twilight into a title without evoking thoughts of Twilight these days. But I'd like to be able to do it. Maybe it's been enough years now, but I have a list of title ideas, and sometimes it'll just come from the title. In fact, Chasing Graves was another idea that I kind of stole the title from. But the other day I was just writing something down. I just accidentally wrote something along the lines of Knights of Twilight. I was like, right, going in the book. Nice. And I can imagine this whole, world of darkness coming from that. And I was just like, right, cool. That'll be schedule that in for sometime in the future, 2027 or something.
The idea hopper, the never-ending growing collection.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure and a pain at the same time, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Better to have too many than too few.
Exactly. It's never a bad idea to write, or I would say it's an incredibly kind of crucial idea to note down all the ideas that you have, whatever it is, because the times that I've found myself in a little bit of a slump, because I'm kind of on the planning side of the spectrum. So I do write kind of large kind of note documents, about 5,000 words, minimum of just kind of notes, ideas, threads, storylines, plots, characters, all sorts of stuff. So, when I'm kind of doing that, it's so useful when I kind of hit a gap to go back to that ideas document, and something that could have been a book or kind of like I don't know, a main character or a main element of another book or another idea, I can actually just borrow and slot straight in. So yeah, kind of fun.
So zooming back out a little bit to the kind of the overarching idea of world building, is it something that all authors do, or is it just more the domain of genre authors?
I think, you could argue, and I have at bars and cons, that you could say that any author who even writes in the real world, kind of modern day real world genre fiction, let's say, I don't know, romance, thriller, crime, anything like that, you do technically world build, because especially if it's kind of close to the character and it's close perspective and or even first person, they have to have a world. We all have worlds around us, cityscapes, landscapes, that sort of thing. And so you kind of have to do an essential, I think, piece of it, no matter what you write, even if you're just saying, like, this guy lives in San Francisco and, he goes through this bar and this cafe, and these are the streets that he walks on, and this is where this crime happens or this event happens, or, you have to build this kind of microcosm. Otherwise, then I think, the more you lean towards kind of the SFF genres, or even just, some other kind of weird fiction genres and things like that, the more you have to build, because the world doesn't exist around your characters. And the more you have to make shit up. Yeah, that's essentially it. And so, when you get talking, high fantasy and stuff, it's to the level of, I don't know, kind of like Warhammer, 40K, the history documents, and your Lord of the Rings level, when you're completely out of the way of the kind of and completely in the secondary world fantasy, then you've got a lot of building to do. So there's kind of just it's inherent in the genres we choose and kind of the books we write. But I think everyone builds a world to a certain extent, which I think is fun. I'm actually really excited to someday write going on a complete tangent here, but really excited to someday write a book in the real world and just do the world building from that side of things and just mess around. I got a little taste in the Scarlet Star Trilogy because it is alternate history, so it's set in Wyoming, but that is the absolute frontier of the known world, and no one's traveled past that. And it's set in London, and there is a Queen Victorious, and so there's a lot of kind of history being dug out of that. But again, not modern day, not real world. So it'd be fun. Knowing me, I'd have to put something strange and made up in there anyway. So.
Oh, of course. That tends to be my brand a bit. Is take the real world and give it one hard twist in one area. But one thing that I found with using the real world is that even though it all exists, it's almost like, at the very least, if you didn't want to call it world building, it's at least world curation, right? Because you can't include all of the information. So you're picking and choosing what makes it in, what gets focused on, and all of that.
100%. Yeah, world creation is a great way to put it, or curation rather. World borrowing, I've heard before as well. It's that sort of, it kind of bleeds into, I think, the spectrum of writing. And, are you an architect or a gardener? And I think, sometimes it works, it kind of intermeshes with that. It's one of my favorite parts, hence why we're chatting about this. But it is absolutely same. Probably I've bored quite a few people in my time actually doing that. Hopefully not doing it today.
Oh, we are fans of tangents and going after the wild goose, so it's totally fine for me here.
Let's do it.
Okay, so what are some of your favorite literary worlds from a world building standpoint? The ones that just really stuck with you, and also if you could talk a little bit about what you think made them work so well.
I think the one that always, let's get the obvious one out first. Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth. Is I know it's a huge influence because it was so popular and it's just so embedded in our society, especially or in our genre in general. And it's so vast and it's so detailed, and even he could have built a quarter of that and it still would have stood up to some of the most detailed worlds we still have. So yes, huge love for Tolkien, and I think that was what really instilled in me when I was a kid, how vast and how detailed a secondary world, you could even argue like tertiary world, could be. And I was one of these kids that was making up languages and alphabets and things like that when I was first writing it. age 9 all the way through, early teens. And, it really kind of, I think, led me down that path of, true's not the right word, led me down that path of, just full world building and just full secondary world. And, even though I have bled into the real world a little bit, my love will always be, and my focus will always be on just whisking that reader through a doorway or through a window of just complete fantasy. And, having these little touch points to help people recognize things as they go through. But otherwise, just, somewhere that they would never see before outside of this book or outside of the genre. Lord of the Rings really taught me how to do that. So it's got to be there. Secondary one, or second one would be Mortal Engines, or The World of Mortal Engines by Philip Reed. My God, when I first picked that up when I was a kid, I don't know, I read Mortal Engines, and the idea of cities moving around was so completely fantastical. And obviously, it kind of had been done in different forms before in terms of scale. But, at that time, this is, I feel like I test my knowledge now. I feel like it's 10 years ago, but the pandemic's just stretched everything out, so it's probably like 20. Probably definitely 20 years ago. Around that time, it was just so groundbreaking. And just the kind of it wasn't about the depth that Lord of the Rings was and the scope. It's more about like the who gives a shit. Let's just have this and let's be wild and wacky and make it work. Let's really push the boundaries, have entire cities. There's a bit where they mention in the first book, and I think it's featured later on, is the idea of an ice skating city called Archangel in Russia. And I was just like, wow. It's so, I don't know, so wholesome for the brain, for the imagination. And so, that's always stuck with me. It's inspired a lot of things, especially coming back to this new series. My mile-high trees move. So, having that scale of something moving around and just, dwarfing the main characters, I just love it. And they did a good job of the film as well, I suppose. Peter Jackson, he gets a lot of love from me, but it's a hard thing to pull off.
For sure.
But otherwise, number 3, mainly because it's kind of prominent in my mind at the moment, is just Rorschach from the Stormlight Archive, or Rorschach, or however you can say it however you want. I just think that really gripped me. It feels very, very real. It feels incredibly true. Just, through Brandon Sanderson's, descriptive powers, and, the way that you also view it from the multiple different POVs that he has, as opposed to the other 2 examples. It's obviously there are multiple POVs in effect, but it is very centered around the main character, or main kind of squad. And so, just the ability to see this whole spread of this world and this whole depth of this world, and have it so interactive in the plots and in the worlds of the characters, the storms, for example, and the way it shapes the world and the creatures and the flora and the fauna. Love it. That one will always stick with me. Can't wait to finish that. There's so many books I've kind of fallen back behind it, and they are absolute tomes. They are tree trunks of books. So I've got a lot of reading to do.
Yeah. I find for me a lot of the times, the worlds that I can't kind of emotionally escape. Like one that always comes to mind for me is we actually talked about it in a previous episode recently. Is the book Vert by Jeff Noon. I don't know if you've read that one.
I haven't go around to that yet.
Oh, that one. It's very, basically it's VR, but drug-induced VR.
Sounds good.
It's just dark and gritty, and that it's one of those books where you're just constantly getting kicked in the chest as you read it. And most people wouldn't like that. I tend to like that, but it just you can't. It never lets you go, right? And it's just you talked about this earlier, where it's the world is a character, right? The world is really performing all of these duties and acting, right? It has a role to play in what's going on. All right, let's jump back to our drink. One thing we talk about in every episode is smell and taste, because in writing, they're the most overlooked senses. And so I like to bring that back a little bit here. So when you're having an old fashioned, what are you getting from it? What are those smells, those tastes, those sensations?
Well, I should know that. I drink enough of them. I should just know that. To me, I mean, the predominant one is orange. I do this thing where I'm kind of cheating here, because I spent a lot of my time being a cocktail barman in a range of bars back in the UK. So I don't know, I wouldn't say I've got some skills, but I've got a few little skills. And so one of the things I kind of like to do with an old fashioned is the trick of, I mean, you can't see it on stick, but in terms of you kind of get the orange peel. I have one prepared, and then you sort of get it between finger and thumb, and you do the trick where you kind of squeeze it and then hold a lighter, and it does that. The oil just flares up. Yeah,
I do the same thing with mine.
Then makes it, yay! I love it, and it makes it shiny. It brings the kind of like the charred orange out, and I just take it over the rim of the glass and just rub it around before throwing it in. So you get that kind of, when you approach the glass, I love this.
I like that. I hadn't thought about
glass, you get that smoky thing. Yeah, it's amazing. And so that really leads it. And then otherwise, then you get kind of I'm using bullet bourbon for my old fashioned. So it's kind of, this slight smoke, but mostly the kind of caramel, the kind of the hit of cinnamon and stuff like that a little bit. And then otherwise, I should have a cherry in here, but I couldn't find any of those in the shop. So yeah, otherwise with taste, I mean, you get the kind of the, oh man, I never get a chance to really describe stuff unless I do a fight scene. A feast scene. I never get to describe stuff like this. But yeah, otherwise, just think. See, I'm getting obviously the spice of the alcohol mixed with more of the caramel, the sugar. I use dark sugar in there, and then it kind of tapers off with that kind of bitter orange from the oil. And then also the Angostura bitters, which I've got in there as well, which I do like a lot of.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of sweet mixed with the spice and then the bitterness as well. So I think that's what I'm getting.
So this is actually
what about you?
Funny.
What do you get?
So we set this up so that we would each kind of make our own take and then talk about it. But
exactly,
mine's pretty damn similar. I've got bullet rye instead of the bourbon.
Okay.
And then, so I do Angostura, but I also do orange bitters as well.
Interesting. That's a good
just because I used to do a little bit of orange juice in there because I like mine really kind of orange forward as well. But I find the bitters is a little bit, it leaves the booze a little bit more pure, so you get more of those flavors coming through. Yeah. I love your idea about hitting the rim after you flame the orange. That's a genius idea. I'm definitely going to steal that.
It's something, I mean, it's probably one of those things that's more pretentious looking than it actually has a function, but it does have a little bit of a function.
Oh, any excuse to play with fire.
Cosmopolitans.
Yeah,
exactly. And it looks pretty good, especially if you get a big chunk of orange and obviously, the flames of the oil as you squeeze it, so inwards comes out. It's always great on a bar. But yeah, Cosmos, I used to do it with as well, because obviously you've got kind of, it adds to the cranberry flavor, and kind of the hit of the vodka as well. That's the I used to do it on. Anything with kind of like that can kind of support that strong orange flavor, adding that bit of bitterness to it, and kind of bringing it to the top of the glass. Love it. Yeah. Makes you want to just do some cocktails, like do a guest spot in a bar. Just working on it. But I forget the work side of things. I always remember just the fun stuff and trying to flair and just, making cocktails and having that, it's like a little showmanship, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah. What I don't miss and what I do forget about is the dragging the bar mats up at the end of the night and scrubbing the floor, catching barflies with one of those electric tennis rackets.
Well, you mentioned cherries. By the end of the episode, or after the episode's over, I will send you a recipe for brandied cherries. I
literally just mentioned this is what I need. I need to macerate or brandy or something, some cherries.
the trick with the cherries I found is, and I don't know why this is, but it has to be French brandy, not Italian brandy.
Interesting.
For some reason, I did exactly the same recipe. That was the only thing that changed. And they were both good, but the Italian version just didn't work as well for some reason. Anyway, I'll get you the recipe. It's really easy and really good.
Too much sugar? I don't know. Yeah, I'd be interested to find out.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Cheers, absolutely. Yeah, cheers. All right, so jumping back in with world building, authors are often pretty intimidated by the thought of having to build a world. And I think a lot of that stems from the perception of basically having to do it all, having to build an entire world from scratch, when I mean, really, you're never doing that, and it would almost be, in a way, possibly detrimental. So how do you go about choosing what real world aspects you add to your world, and then what is a purely created aspect?
I think so. Kind of focusing on the genesis point of the story, I'll always kind of like basically have that as the core and build out from there. So let's take the idea of Jason Grace, for example. The idea, as I mentioned, was just having this kind of the idea that you could bond ghosts after their death, or bodies after their death, and then kind of take their soul. It's called a shade in the book. You are just a spectral form, and you are bound to a person through necromagic, and you have to serve them, or you actually are, killed off and completely dead and irreversibly so. So with that, essentially, it was daunting. So I'm thinking, this is a fine Genesis point, but there's a huge amount of work to do here to build an entire world that's essentially half dead. It affects a huge amount of stuff. So, it's daunting, but then I think, I kind of approach it from what's the word I'm looking for? I approach it from a kind of strategy of layering over everything that we understand and recognize in our real world. And then I, like I said, overlay that on my idea, find parallels from it, and then kind of either expand or remove to make things a bit unique. So, for example, I always go down the list of things like religion. Everything that we have in our world on a day-to-day basis, less day-to-day, for example, you might not be religious or it might not affect you, but it exists, in our globe somewhere at some place. So, for instance, religion, flora and fauna, things like recreation, things like transport and travel, things like beasts of burden, things like clothing, fashion, trends, political ideas, the list goes on. Anything that you could map from our world, industry, fuel sources, I just thought those two as well. So all sorts of things like that. Oh, currency, there's another one. Either way, as you can see, list goes on and on and on and on. So what you can do is basically say, and what I did is think, no religion in this world. So that was something I, thought about, wrote it down as one parallel, and thought actually the absence or the kind of the surplus of ghosts and the mastery over death means that, humans don't really care about gods. They don't give a shit anymore. They're gone, they're dead. So we have the absence of religion, and then I can bring it back later into something that's very unique to the world once the reader's kind of invested in the world. So you can kind of map things with stuff like a recreation. It's purely for the rich and powerful in my world, because the rest are literally the dead or just so downtrodden by this kind of top-down system and this world of murder and soul catching and brutality. That they have no recreation. They're working. So you're talking big parties. You're talking things like, arenas, all sorts of grand, exciting stuff. So through that method, I'm kind of just finding the parallels, deciding what to keep, what to change, what to omit, and then translating it into my world. And that's where the kind of the uniqueness, a lot of that comes from, is then let's say if you have currency, using that as an example, what is the currency? So in Chasing Grace, it was souls, but also have the currency running alongside it, which is the copper coins. And then you have gold and gems and things like that, things of other worth, like we do. And then you can think, well, actually, I'm going to have, human ears, if you want to go dark, a currency based on how many people you kill, which again is kind of part of the Chasing Grace world. The king, the emperor has the most souls. Whoever has the most souls owns the most slaves, rules. So you just follow these parallels, follow the structure. The trick and the kind of skill from it is recognizing all the aspects of our world, taking a real kind of varied look at the things that we have around us, and then the decisions side of things of omitting and kind of twisting, and then also kind of the uniqueness you add on the end of it in terms of how it features in your world. And from that you can go to kind of how does it play a part. How do you just follow these threads essentially, how does it affect the characters, how am I going to feature it, how do I describe it, and then that's where if you're kind of twisting everything and adding everything and making it incredibly fantastical and otherworldly, that's you make sure you're adding the breadth through the sheer kind of things you thought through, as well as the just kind of secondary world element, and through actually twisting it and changing it. So that's kind of I think I might have straight off there, but that is basically kind of how I approach it, so that it isn't daunting to me, and then instead it's actually exciting. So I'm thinking, I've got a lot of work to do, but it's a lot of kind of fun work. This is why I really love alternate history as well, because you have those parallels laid out, and then you just get to twist and take them away and do stuff like that. So I had a lot of fun with that, Weird West trilogy I did. But I mean, going back to the daunting side of things, it is difficult, and mainly because a lot of people think they have to build an entire, you keep using the word globe, entire world. And actually, we can kind of stick to a country, a continent, sometimes even a city, and we can kind of have like almost an ether of further lands and other detail around it, which is useful for adding more kind of believability and intrigue for the reader. But we don't, we shouldn't be starting with everything. We shouldn't be going from world, continents, countries, cities. We should be going from cities or even towns out to the country, and then maybe if it's actually pertinent to the story, the plot, or to the detail of the world. Star Trek does that quite well. I love this. It's a sci-fi example, but it's something I always think of when I was just chatting about just what food they want. Just like, would you like some Klingon blood wine?
Yeah.
So you're not necessarily seeing the whole planet of Klingon. You don't have to. I mean, they obviously have and do, but you don't. Let's say if you're just mentioning that as a throwaway line, you give this kind of perspective or just this insight into another area of the planet without having to build it, or if you're not doing planets, plane, whatever you want. So that's kind of how I get around it, or how I recommend a lot of authors should get around it is, start around the microcosm of the character. If you started with the character first, if you started with the world first, take it down to its smallest point and work through the parallels of our real world for inspiration and for guidance. And then, just have fun with it. Because you could just sprawl out loads of ideas. You don't have to use them all. You can just throw them in, kind of breadcrumb them here and there. It's great.
And from an organization standpoint, what would you recommend for newbie authors who are just getting their feet wet when it comes to world building? Do you have any tips or tricks on how to approach kind of the just organizing your thoughts around it?
Yeah. I'd say probably start small, just so you can kind of have, what is this town called? What are its people? Is it a mining town? Is it a river town? Is it, I don't know, using town as an example. Could be anything. Could be, a region, however small you want to start. And then essentially kind of working through, I write it down. Like I said, I'm on the planning structure, as a planning side of the spectrum. So I just write it down in terms of, the name of the place. In fact, I've got a star sheet on my website that kind of helps with this, like a story Bible. And it's just essentially how I do it. So I have tables of, the timeline, history of the world, and again, the parallels, the currency, the religion, social rankings, how royalty works. I should put it up here on my screen. Let's look through some more. But flora and fauna, things. So is it a wallet or a coin purse? Things like that. Kind of small stuff. And then you kind of can add some style through that. And then otherwise, just working through it, working through the beasts, working through, currency, religion, all those sorts of things, and just noting it down. Because otherwise, you can forget things as well. And the act of writing things down into a document is somehow cathartic and just like locks it in, while allowing you to forget about it and think of other things. So big fan of noting things down, even if you're not one of the, a planner, let's say. I think it's just a real useful process to do that. And just it really kind of introduces you to your own world, because you have to know it better than the reader. You have to be saying, hello, welcome. I'm going to show you this bit. Then I'm going to show you this bit, but we're not going to see this bit yet. That's later.
Absolutely.
I mean? But I might want to hint about it. So it's all about, you'll discover it as well. That's another thing I kind of want to get across is I like to do it beforehand, but I'll tell you what, I do a huge amount of world building within the novel, to the point where maybe a third or half of it that I might have written down in a plan isn't lost, or isn't, it's a process. It isn't lost, it isn't kind of changed, it's definitely in there in some sort of format. But then I come up with other ideas, chapter 10, 15, 20, even, 30, right at the end. I suddenly think, this is a cool thing I need. And then I go back. That's what the drafts are for. So again, don't feel, I would say to debut authors, don't feel that you have to do everything, even at the start. Allow the process to happen naturally and organically as well. And you'll suddenly realize, like, no, I want this sort of character or this sort of beast in there. And just put it in the drafts. It's fun. No one's ever going to see anything until you're kind of necessarily happy with it. So, sorry about that. No one's going to necessarily see anything, until you're happy with it. So, and that's why we've got beta readers and editors. So, I always like to make sure people get away from this idea that whatever you put down in a plan or a first draft is concrete and it's taken very seriously. And this must be it. It must be right first time. Hell no.
Absolutely.
God, I would change things 10 years on, from a book I wrote a couple of years back, just because you're constantly learning, you're constantly coming up with new ideas. That's it.
Do you find that as you're collecting ideas for your world building, that you, thinking about kind of when they're hitting you, do you tend to have, you know, your big bag of ideas that you're sprinkling in as you go and then add a few more? Or do you find that you're adding in enough to keep the progress going and then adding a lot more in a second or third draft?
Yeah, I would say most of it is done in the first draft. So like I said, I map out what I think is the world. And as I get into it, I would say, like I said, 50% of that or a third of that will change. But I mean, compared to its kind of original format, I would keep basically 75% or 100% of the world building that I came up with at the start in.
Yeah.
A lot of it's thrown out, a lot of it doesn't work. I find new ideas and things like that. So that kind of works. It's hard to, again, it's one of these things that's hard to do because it also changes for other books as well. This new book that I'm writing is a lot more discovery for me. I've planned a huge amount, but I'm also just kind of following where I go. So yeah, a lot of that is then updating what I had in mind, and I'm discovering a lot. And then it becomes a trick of making sure you're keeping track of it. So using that story Bible less as a plan, but more as a tracker. So writing down that I put in this creature that I'm bound to forget I've mentioned in the next chapter.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's always fun. Yeah, going back and seeding things in.
All right, so one thing I've seen happen, I would say it's not ultra common, but it does happen, is that sometimes authors go a bit too far with their world building. And so what might be some of the hallmarks that would help someone who's writing their story avoid kind of pushing the envelope a little too far with what they're creating and what they're adding?
I think it comes in at two stages. So let's say if you are like me and you're on the planning side of the spectrum, you like to plan things out before diving into the book. I would say that there is the danger there of going too far behind the scenes and just spending the days that you should have switched into writing still planning and feeling like you have to map every single piece of minutiae out. And like I say, I do an extensive plan, and it's I discover a lot when I'm writing, and I kind of stick along to it, roughly speaking. But I still don't map out everything. Not every tiny little piece. It's almost impossible. And that task is, it's down to the writing, not the planning. So at some point you've got to switch, and you've got to say, this is more than I need, or exactly what I need to go forward, and to be able to draw in these things without sort of thinking them on the fly, to be able to describe the world perfectly, and to be able to kind of put the characters into peril and have them move around. So there is a point where you're going to have to say, no, done enough planning, and get to the book. So that's a mistake that a lot of people can make, is that they will focus too much on that, and it's comforting, think I'm not actually writing, so I can just stick in this little cocoon of like this fantasy world, and it's all fun. You got to describe it, you got to make it into a story. So that's, I think, where that problem kind of first affects authors. Otherwise, where it becomes apparent in the actual product, in the book itself, let's say, and I think some pitfalls that authors can fall into is over description, first of all. So feeling that their book is essentially so fantastical that they have to explain every single little bit of it, whereas you can leave a bit of discovery, and this is what info dumping kind of refers to, is describing the shape of the buildings in this. Let's say we take the first chapter and we're introduced to this world. And if we're introduced to it via detail because you're so proud of this world and it is, let's say, incredibly vibrant, don't just show it, tell it. Oh, sorry, the other way around.
Oh, yeah.
Don't just tell it.
Yeah.
Show it. Oh my God. Yeah, you got to change that one. So yeah, don't just tell it. You've got to show it around. So you basically have to make sure that you are using the characters who interact with the world, instead of just saying, there is a city. This city is shaped like this. This is the history of the city. It's founded in this year, and it had this war at this time, and this has left this scar, and because of that, these people do this. That's not a story. That's like literally a description. And so use the characters. You spread things out. Avoid info dumping like the plague, and only feature when it matters to enhance the plot, deepen the world, or add a bit of intrigue. Things like that. So that's kind of how I approach it. Myself, is to make sure I'm never kind of giving more than, or dumping it's kind of subjective depending on how complicated your world is. I do a lot more info dumping, for example, in Chasing Graves than Emaneska, because the world is kind of, it's expected. It's a Nordic world. There's ice. We've all seen ice before.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing. So you can get away with, short descriptions on things that we recognize, but also just making sure that you're teasing it. You're kind of revealing, you're slowly sliding back the curtain rather than just going, here's a whole new world that you've got to be blown away by. So I think, that's one of the major problems is that kind of slow is kind of the wrong word, gradual, I'd say, depending on whichever speed you do that, gradual unveiling of the world, so that people constantly feel that they're discovering. Humans love to discover stuff.
Yeah.
We're naturally curious. So that's, I think, the two areas that it affects.
Yeah, I think that's right on. Sometimes you feel like you almost need to have taken a class about the story beforehand just so you can understand all of the details, because they jump in so fast. Or you'll get the ones where, and I totally understand the mindset behind this, but sometimes it'll be like, well, they wouldn't call it Thursday in this world, so I got to come up with new names for the days of the week. And I totally understand that, but on the flip side, it's like, well, they wouldn't have written in English either. So it's a translation.
Exactly.
So
it is the translation. And I think, in fact, that's a fantastic point, because fantasy, and going back to my process of world building, finding those parallels and translating them is exactly that. You have to make it understandable for the reader, and so some things do have to be the same. Swords, for example. I have a thing where I don't have horses a lot in my worlds. They only feature in. Do they even feature, actually? No, there are no. Nope, there is a horse. There's absolutely a horse. Chasing Graves has horses. But either way, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's just very easy to just drop in something that we all know and recognize, and just there are readers out there who will basically say, well, if this is a fantasy world, then how would you have the evolution that got to a horse? Yes, but would you like me to? I'd go the other way, and I've had reviews about this where I create something that, basically I go not too far. I'm blending lizards and horses, and so I have this kind of scaly horse things in Heart of Stone. And I had plenty of reviews of people just saying oh, you just stick with the horse. We all know what a horse is. So you can't please everyone. And that is, that goes through world building, that goes through, character design, it goes through just writing in general. We cannot please everyone, nor should we try.
Yes.
And so, everyone's got a different style. Everyone bleeds information a different way. But there are some things you can do to suit more people than just a small niche, let's say. Yeah. And so I think, that feeds into that, where you've got we have night and day, we have, swords, we have beasts of burden. Just, there's definitely a line to be struck. But, it's about relaxing, essentially, and having fun with it. So I think if that comes through more than the actual details, and I'm a pedant. I get stuck up on things like that as well. But
All right, let's pop back to our drink again. And I think we're going to do a little world building of our own. So thinking about an old fashioned, thinking about the mood, thinking about, a setting where it would be perfect to drink this drink. Create that for it. What would that scene be? What would that world look like? The perfect world for an old fashioned.
I read this question as in, what is my perfect setting for an old fashioned?
And that's fine. That's totally fine.
No. So I think, to me, it's not everyone's drink. I know that because half my friends, most of my friends, refuse to drink them. So I'd say, I want to steer clear from the classic cop-out tavern scene. I would say this is the sort of drink that someone would have before battle. Thinking off the top of my head, because I read this question completely differently.
No,
I would think it's one of those things. No worries. I think it's one of those things where maybe you have this character, I'm just imagining this in my head, sort of standing over the conquering of a city, and watching it from afar and being very happy and pleased with themselves, and about to wade in and grab the final glory of the scene by, decapitating the monster or something, basically landing that final blow, which is going to get him all of the glory, but none of the toil. And I think, having some sort of diminutive, obsequious servant coming up and saying, here is your old fashioned, sir. And then he just takes this victorious swig, drains half of it in one go, and then just says, and now my sword. Jumps on his griffin or dragon or, I don't know, giant eagle and flies off. Lands in a cool slam of magic. That's what I think. Let's go with that.
I love it. And I like that scene. It's funny how, for such a simple drink, I feel like, especially if you're a little bitters heavy with it, it does have a pretty indulgent feel to it. like kind of that smooth, satiny, rich.
100%. Yeah, and usually expensive in most of the bars around here as well. So you're kind of like, I'm going to treat myself, and I better enjoy this. That's it. But yeah, just to go back to how I kind of thought about this, how I'd answered it, and that's my bad for not reading the notes.
No. I changed it up a little bit on you. Sorry.
That's all good. No worries. It's great. I get to have two answers for one question. I'm happy. Speaking of bars, I like to kind of work out in cafes and bars and pubs and things like that, and just be around as much as we can now. Be around people. It's fun for like coming up with characters and stuff like that. Just being like, who do I make you look like? And then there's someone right there to kind of describe. But it gets me out of the house, away from the desk, and it's just a fun environment to write in. And so one of the places down here just sits on this really nice kind of classic street. It's called Government Street in Victoria. It's just got lots of trees, lots of people. It's pedestrianised, it's demotorized, and there's just a nice bar, obviously, with a little patio, and they do a mean old fashioned, which I think mine are slightly better, but they have great cherries, so swings around the house. And I just sit there, and it's nice and covered and shady, and it's a great place to write. It's one of my favorite little places. So yeah, that's my scene for an old fashioned, is a kind of dappled sunlight afternoon where it's not too hot, no breeze, and I'm just chilling, hopefully cranking out some words.
Nice. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm running out now. That's the problem.
All right, jumping back to our world building. What do you think are some common mistakes people make when they're trying to world build? And additionally, are there any elements that you think are specifically hard to get right?
Ooh, good question. So, mistakes. I would say, kind of aside from the two that we've already spoken about in terms of getting stuck into your plan and also info dumping in your early sections in the book, I would say one of the common mistakes is maybe not thinking deep enough and sort of, introducing those anachronisms and details that actually might not be present in your world and that you could have maybe tweaked a bit more to be fantastical. I think that's probably the best way to describe or answer that. It says, going to the other side of the spectrum from info dumping is being a little lazy. There's this kind of, I don't know, when everyone uses like gold coins and everyone's got a horse, everyone's got a sword, everyone's in the same sort of armor, and it's, prevalent throughout fantasy. So I like to see that changed. This is why I loved, might want to cut that out because that example has just absolutely fled from my head. Okay. But yeah, in any case, I like to see, just in general, I like to see kind of differences. I like to see just little twists. And I think sometimes a lot of fantasy books could be made just a little bit better by kind of pushing that boundary a little bit further. Is instead of just your classic longsword, maybe change it up to some random weapon. I don't know, a whip with a blade on the end, a hammer. Even though little touches like that can just, this is more character design than world building, but obviously it translates. I think, not pushing the envelope enough in your genre. Otherwise, I would say elements that are hard to get right is made up languages. Or, I tell you what, no, let's wind that back. In terms of common sayings that don't, so for instance, I read a book, and this I think we'll come back to in terms of my piece in a minute. One of the books I read had Latin in it, and in terms of like mea culpa, and it just drove me mental, and for more reasons that I'm sure we'll get onto. But it just, it's less, it escapes the kind of the line, or steps over the line of translation, and just borrows a completely real world thing. It's almost like something having a cell phone in medieval times. Maybe not that bad, but it's just, it stuck with me that much. So I think, some people will maybe kind of skip over things, or again, it comes from maybe just practice and, knowledge and research and things like that. But sometimes I think people will think about something and throw it in, maybe without the research, or, it happens a lot with phrases. It happens a lot with sometimes technological things. Again, you can kind of mess around with it and say it's powered by magic, which is always fun. Fantasy is great. I think, sci-fi, you kind of have to put slightly more technological nous into it. But again, you just say it's powered by magic, or it's magic. I kind of make fun of that in my books as well. But I would say that's probably the two one of the main elements that I think people kind of struggle with. I would say, trying not to bleed into character design. Languages, yeah, we'll talk about that. So I think languages in general, and also kind of going into place names, character names a little bit in terms of like finding a route. So a lot of people choose, like I have a Nordic route, a Greek or Roman route, Mesoamerican route, and further afield, a lot of Asian routes as well. People can, get comfortable by being grounded in that kind of like theme or setting, that sort of thing, which is good. But again, I think an element that's hard to get right is, of course, appropriation as well. You can't just decide this is it.
Yeah.
You've at least, if you decide to kind of set your world somewhere that maybe is not your locational culture, you've got to approach that carefully as well. And I think you can do it kind of respectfully as well by, you're writing a book and you've been inspired by it. There's a lot of respect there, but you just got to bear a lot of things in mind. So I find that comes up with a lot of language in terms of, we're just going to base it on this language and we're just going to steal it and change it around and that sort of thing, it's difficult to do because obviously our world is rooted in us. Yeah. We take inspiration from us. So it's hard to do, but yeah, it just, I think, deserves a bit more thought than, sometimes a lot of people put in. No offense intended. Because we're all learning all the time. And I've done it as well.
So piggybacking on that a little bit, thinking about world building effectiveness, what elements do you think get added or are left out that make a world less effective?
One that springs to mind immediately is pets. Some people use animals purely for transport, which is fine because you can still kind of add a lot of, I like to add a lot of kind of character to the beasts that you encounter through any point. I'm always kind of using them as a feature. But I think animals play a huge part in our lives, especially pets, and they make a great character and great sidekick as well. As long as, you don't kind of use them for shock factor like a certain owl and a certain boy wizard series, just in case anyone hasn't read it or seen the films yet, and it's a spoiler, but come on. It's been years.
There definitely is a statute of limitations.
That's it, right? And I think it's used too freely. But using an animal just to have an animal companion as well, and it's just like a presence in like a crew or a squad, I think it's great. I love to use that. And people forget about just having things around. Things like messenger birds has been used a lot on messenger animals, creatures, Saint Bernards with casks of brandy or something around. We've used animals throughout our lives. We domesticated wolves first. And, they have completely changed because of us, and we have changed with them. So, animals in our world are a huge part of it, and I think can play a huge part in fantasy worlds. The other one is, I just had it as well, because I like going through I'm just basically going through my list in my head. Recreation is actually one that is, and sometimes to an extent, food. It's more of a given, or it's kind of just like, I don't know, meat, cheese, ale, stuff like that. And it's that, or maybe some biscuits on the road. I don't know. The usual kind of traveling stuff. But I mean, you could go a lot further with it. You could kind of have food that is intertwined with society, that's intertwined with, I don't know, the plot. I'd love to see a chef fantasy.
Oh, that would be really cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, in fact, I think that's Michael Miller's new book. One of my recommendations actually is Ascendant, his new Dragon series, which is the main character is a cook. So he's got lots of cooking scenes, which is, he mentioned it, and I've yet to read it, but really looking forward to it. And hopefully I've got that name right, because he's bringing out another one, and I can't remember if I've switched the names, but we'll say Ascendant. And it's great, and it's got a blind dragon in as well, which is again a nice little twist that I haven't seen a lot of times. In fact, that brings me onto it actually. So aside from recreation, aside from food and kind of rest and relaxation, I think because everyone's fighting things and everyone's dealing with lots of important world-ending stuff, we often forget the downtime. And that's usually eating around a campfire, but I think it could be explored more. But otherwise, things like, representation of the different, just facets of our world, people with disabilities, people of different skin colors. Especially in a connected world where you've got lots of trade, and let's say we talked about those continents that you don't have to feature. But, even if you look through our history, everyone was being intermingled quite early on. There's a lot of travel, a lot of trade, a lot of people just kind of fighting against other people, and a lot of cultures clashing. So why not put it in your fantasy books? It's just examples of a richer world, especially if you've got lots of different landscapes with lots of different kind of genetic adaptation over through cultures and things like that. So yeah, I think those are probably the main things that get missed out, or just maybe not missed out, but overlooked and maybe not explored a lot.
Yeah. All right, so jumping on from that, what are some of your pet peeves when it comes to world building? Things where they just don't seem to work out.
I would say, I mean, the one, I'm not going to name any names because I don't believe in kind of trashing my fellow authors, but there was a book I read where it was so heavily, it was supposed to be secondary world, and there's Latin running all the way through it. I'm not just talking, just like, because there's obviously a huge amount of romantic and Latin words that have infused into English, of course, but I'm talking like quoting Latin and yet having no explanation of where it's coming from. And it, like I said, drove me crazy. So having just a blatant real world thing, an element, a piece of your world that just hasn't been fleshed out just because you want to feature Latin, for example, that's going to get me as well. Info dumping has probably got to be the other one. When I've got to wade through maybe 2 pages of explanation to get to either action or dialogue or a step forward in the plot. It's a DNF.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, and it's some people like that, and I do like that. After reading the appendices of Lord of the Rings multiple times, I've got a huge appetite and quite a tolerance for reading lore just over and over. But you've got to also entertain.
Yeah.
Bear the reader in mind. So yeah, I'd say those are pet peeves if I'm reading kind of objectively as a fellow author, not just as a reader. Those are the things that get me. Sometimes just inaccuracies as well. Again, it would never stop me reading a book because this is one of the things that I put my own failings aside. But if someone's mentioned a sword being a different type of sword when it's not, stuff like that.
Yeah.
A horse when it's a cow. Stuff along those lines that just kind of niggles the pedant in me, but it's not enough for me to kind of take anything away from that author or that book. It's just my own personal preference. So that is very, very pet peeve, but yeah.
Okay, and so what are some of the things that you wish were used more?
I would say, it would probably be, hopefully not a cop-out, but I think, similar to my answer to the previous question, where it's, it's kind of a lot more animals that aren't killed off for the owl effect. I would say, more representation of, genders. I would do, sexual preferences, cultures, disabilities. It's gone is that time where we can just have everyone as white and healthy and male. It just isn't representative of who we are in the world, and it shouldn't have been ever. But so I think dealing with those sorts of things, I personally like as well when a world kind of has this comment. It's not for everyone, but I like it when it's it draws from the world or shows you another facet of our current world and social and political climate. I don't mind necessarily being rammed in the face or something when it comes to like a point in a book or a theme of a book, but I like it when it's very kind of cleverly done, and it's just sort of saying like, you recognize the parallels here and the problems here. Oh, look at what we've got around.
Just kind of that holding that mirror up to the real world.
A little bit. Exactly that. I kind of like it. I find it very clever. I find it when it's done cleverly as well. I find it very satisfying. I think a lot of people want to just read fun fantasy adventure, which is fine, but if you can sneak in something and change someone's mind for the better without preaching it or being subversive, why not? Why not indeed?
All right, Ben, it is last call here at the Indie Pub. Can you give an indie published book or 2 or 3 or more that you think people should check out?
Absolutely, got a load of them. So my writing buddy David Estes, who's incredibly successful, bestseller in more categories than I can remember, has just brought out a new book called Kingfall, which is kind of a sequel to his really successful Fate Mark series. So I'm really excited about digging into it. And it's done really well for itself, and I just hear amazing things, and David's a great guy. Otherwise, and a fantastic author, I should point out. Otherwise, Rob J. Hayes has just brought out Spirits of Vengeance as well, which it's got a really cool cover. It's Asian-inspired fantasy. It just looks so good, and it's in his Mortal Technique series as well. So really excited about going to that. And Norylska Groans as well, by Clayton, Snyder and Michael R. Fletcher. they've co-authored it, and they run one of my. I just got the chance to interview them a couple of weeks ago, a month or two back, and it just sounds really fun, like Russian gangster noir with a fantasy feel, and magic, and the classic grimdark, funny, hilarious dark wit. So yeah, really excited about those three.
Nice. Okay, same question, but for any other media, indie or not.
Good question. I've been loving all the Marvel series at the moment, particularly Loki. Loki's just one of those characters that's always featured heavily in my books, and is one of my favorites from the MCU. So yeah, I would say that's probably one of the best Marvel series that's come out so far. Otherwise, what else have I been enjoying? I'll tell you what, gaming is kind of a big part of my, when I'm not writing and I do get a chance to game, I've been kind of replaying Dying Light, which is a fantastic zombie free-running game. It's set in Turkey, which is, you're just trapped in the city, and everyone's kind of like, the city's been locked off, and you've been kind of your special forces soldier who's been dropped in to do some special forces stuff. But then you kind of develop these like just free-running things. But this is the amazing world building of it. Is like, you might think, zombie, that's cool, free-running like Assassin's Creed. Yeah, okay, I can see that's the mesh. But the actual like the hook of the world is when the sun goes down in the game, everything changes. The zombies get bigger, faster. The big ones come out. The ones that you are literally, I'm not joking, I've never screamed at a game and thrown my controller across the room like I have for this game, just through fear. Like I've literally just like run from the room because like they run real fast. They're just, it's scary. It is actually, it's not supposed to be a horror game. It's so good. And then it's got great world building. It's got like factions, these tribes. You've got like I could go on about this for another whole hour, but it's got a lot of like building aspect and crafting aspect to it. So it kind of has that almost like RPG kind of sense to it. Lots of leveling up. It's not just kind of your shoot 'em up game. In fact, guns are really hard to get. But yeah, it's fantastic. It's really cool. And the second one's coming out in December. So those are the two things non-book related. Otherwise, I'm reading Shadow of Gods by John Gwynne, which is amazing. It's full of Norse goodness, which I always like, of course, because that's what I write in. And yeah, that's it.
Excellent. All right, tell our listeners what you have going on and where they can find you and your work.
Alrighty. Well, I have just brought out my brand new book, my 15th book, which is the second in the Scalussen Chronicles. It's called Heavy Lies the Crown. I've got it here right with me, but again, showing it off on audio doesn't quite work. But either way, that came out 2 weeks ago. It's a giant quest story, very heavily inspired by Lord of the Rings, and it's a book I've wanted to write since reading Lord of the Rings. And apparently, according to the reviews, I seem to have pulled it off. That's my newest release. And then I'm currently working on book 3 of the Scalussen Chronicles to hopefully have that out first thing next year. That's called To Kill a God. And then otherwise, just finishing off Demon's Reign, which is the book I'm writing with David Estes at the moment, which is, very heavily inspired by kind of, it's a huge mishmash of things, but basically, it's Avatar meets Venom meets Demon Cycle. That's how I'm going to describe it.
Well, it sounds great. And how about your website, socials, that sort of thing?
Absolutely, yes. So you can find me. I'm all over the web. You can find me at BenGalley.com, where I've got lots of free stuff, downloads, like that style sheet I mentioned. I'm also on Patreon /BenGalley. I'm on Twitter and YouTube at /BenGalley as well. And I'm on Instagram and TikTok as BenGalleyAuthor. Just head to my site. You'll find all the links there.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.